Hi, good morning. I'm so thrilled to be here and want to start with some gratitude, how I often like to begin. Thank you to John for the introduction, for bringing me down here, Tom for making everything run so smoothly, and everyone who's here for being here and for bringing whatever you are bringing in the lived experience and in knowledge and in desire into the room. So thank you. And I'm here in a few different senses. I'm here, part of what I'm so excited about this conference and being part of this conference is that it's bringing together knowledge from so many fields and so many different kinds of authority, clinical, policy, various kinds of recovery spaces. And the space that I speak from is a creative space. I teach in a writing program. My students are people with hunger to make things, to write stories, to write their own stories, to write the stories of other people. Those are some of the questions and pursuits that have compelled me for my whole life, how to make things, how to make art. And I grew up, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit today, I grew up steeped in a set of mythologies about the relationship between addiction and substances and the creative life. I grew up with these ideas of the kind of drunken genius, usually a male drunken genius, but I'll say a little more about that. But this idea that, there was this kind of the wild life of a maker, where you lived in self-destructive ways, you drank to excess, and that those precarious states of being and feeling and drinking and self-destruction were part of what art came from, and that actually there was something necessary about that darkness to make art. And when I first got sober, and I say first in a bit of a messy way, I'm here in the room as somebody who's been in recovery for 12 years, but that was not my first attempt to get sober, and I like to talk about that too, because recovery looks a lot of different ways for a lot of different people, and it often involves a lot of attempts and a messy road, and that's part of the road that a lot of us walk. And I think it's important to talk about the mess and the raggedness of that road. But when I was first getting sober, I was really hungry, first of all, to figure out how to live, and second of all, to figure out whether it was possible to be a maker, to be an artist, to be a wild, creative person from spaces of healing and recovery. And so what I'm going to talk about today is my attempt to figure out some of the relationships between recovery, healing, creativity, caregiving for yourself, for other people, and also really my attempt to discover a sort of alternate lineage to this lineage of drunk, messed up artists that I had grown up on, and to see who were makers, who were making from spaces of healing or attempts to heal. And what did that lineage look like? And I am, as John promised, going to talk a little bit about the bakery I was working at when I first got sober. Early sobriety was ruthless. I transcribed it in order to survive it. Those winter days after I first quit drinking were spent working at a small bakery, rolling out sugar cookie snowflakes. I took long drives on the highway across the river. This was in Iowa City in 2010, past dead cornfields and strip malls. Being in motion, any kind of motion, was better than staying in one place. Sobriety had taken away my horizon of relief at the end of each day, the merciful blunting and cloaking and softening of booze, that plush forgiveness. This felt like waking up in the middle of a surgery during which I'd been promised unconsciousness. In truth, I'd been promised nothing, and it wasn't as dramatic as all that. My life wasn't full of blades or deathbeds. It held more mundane sources of discomfort, a relationship saturated by tension and arguments, and a hopeless fear that perhaps nothing else would ever make me feel as good as booze had once felt. I started writing about sobriety not because mine seemed remarkable, but because it didn't. It was full of strip malls and snowdrifts and endless rows of withered corn stalks, raw cookies and burnt cookies and more cookies on my production list. I needed to believe that inside of these ordinary things dwelled some kind of meaning that matched how powerful the experience of sobriety felt. It was a state of ongoing attention. I wanted to turn that attention into something enchanting. At first, it was a species of magical thinking, a spoiled child's bargaining with the world. I wanted sobriety to give me back something beautiful, to compensate for the relief I was learning to live without. Writing sober didn't come easily at first. I was living in the same place where I'd learned to drink. It was where I'd fallen in love with the mythology of the tortured alcoholic genius, excavating brilliance from his crisis. Now I spent evenings with my laptop in two bright coffee shops, perched at windows facing the bars where I'd once gotten drunk, and willed the words to come, to prove that sobriety was going to show me a voice and a way to save my relationship that I couldn't have otherwise found. When my partner Dave and I moved back to New Haven, the city where we've been living, where we were both doctoral students in literature, I understood our move as a new beginning for our relationship and for my writing. Smuggled inside the Trojan horse of my research, my doctoral dissertation, I was going to ask the world a question. What does sober creativity look like? I was going to let the archives answer. The first archive was a disappointment. The writer Charles Jackson was famous for his novel about alcoholic dysfunction from the 1940s, The Lost Weekend, about a single extended bender. But I'd grown excited when I learned that he'd been working on a sequel about sobriety during his on-again, off-again bouts of recovery. His papers were at Dartmouth College, and they had a gloriously disorganized feel, as if I were actually shuffling through old boxes in his attic. His drinking was curiously absent from his letters, but it was everywhere in his wife's. His wife, Rhoda, wrote about his obsession with success, the tentative camaraderie he found in AA fellowship, and the crippling frustration of his relapses. I found a letter where he wrote about finding creative inspiration in recovery, describing, in not exactly humble terms, the epic novel he was working on, which he hilariously titled simply, What Happened? It's far and away the best thing I've ever done, he said, simpler, more honest, and for the first time, out of myself. That is, not self-tortured or self-absorbed or self-eviscerated. No, it's about people, life, if I may say so. My stopping drinking and my enormous interest in AA, if you'll pardon the expression, have a lot to do with this new attitude. Well, everything to do with it, I think. But his manuscript itself, just a loose pile of pages in a box, was tedious, tired, repetitive, and meandering. It lacked urgency. The manuscript bore out some of my worst fears about sobriety, that it was destined to force you into a state of plotless abstraction, a string of empty evenings, a life lit by the sallow fluorescence of church basement bromides rather than the glow of dive bar neon signs. His pages lacked the heat and sizzle of catastrophe. They lacked the heat and sizzle even of events. It was unclear what was happening or if anything was happening. The prose was hopelessly abstract. He wrote, what life means, it came to him, or he seemed to overhear it, it means all the time, not just at isolated dramatic moments that never happened. If life means anything at all, it means whatever it means, every hour, every minute, through any episode, big or small, if only one has the awareness to sense it. Each step, the dramatic and the humdrum alike, every fleeting second of the way. The thing was, I agreed with him. I'd come to believe that life happened every hour, every minute, that it wasn't made of dramatic climaxes so much as quiet effort and continuous presence. But I could also see how Jackson's desperate desire to deploy his recovery wisdom had crippled his story, how he had followed his ideas away from the surges of energy, the peaks and valleys of sculpted experience that lend momentum to narrative itself. My partner Dave had come with me to New Hampshire, and we were renting an attic room in a house in the woods with chickens in the yard and a finished wood-burning stove heating the living room. It felt cozy. The lesbian women who lived there seemed, after years of partnership, both unsentimental and tender with each other. Dave and I, on the other hand, were totally falling apart. Sobriety wasn't saving us as I had hoped it would. The whole trip felt suffused with the taut energy of an attempt to find luminosity in things that refused to yield much glow. Our relationship, Charles Jackson's unpublished manuscript, even the terrible undergraduate production of Angels in America we attended, which looked like a bunch of school kids prancing around in fake beards. It made me feel old. So today, I'm here to talk to you about my own quest to explore the possibilities and potential of sober creativity, to discover the creative lineage I needed to find of writers who had written from the experiences of recovery and sobriety, who had found in the wide-awake spaces of sobriety new and different ways of making. My quest took the form of writing a book, and I'm going to talk about that. But really, it was also a quest to figure out how to be alive and how, more specifically, to stay awake inside my own life. Today, I want to talk about the ways recovery fuels storytelling and the ways that storytelling fuels recovery. Recovery is a process driven by turning our lives into stories that can be shared with others, even as, if you're doing it right, your sense of your own story, I think, is constantly changing. How is storytelling a way of taking care of other people, a way of taking care of yourself, a way of making breathing room around the self to keep being more than you understood yourself to be? I've spent 4 years visiting the archives of writers who had gotten drunk and sometimes tried to get sober and, less frequently, stayed sober, though it was never a destination in a static, unchanging sense, and more a process of constant becoming. Paging through the poet John Berryman's papers in Minneapolis, I found his earnest 12-step work on yellowed paper, and also his frustrated laments that all this 12-step work hadn't done him any good. It hadn't kept him from relapsing over and over again. So screw that first step, he wrote on a slip of paper. This is only a short, true account of my present thinking on the subject. But even after he wrote, screw that, he turned over the slip and scribbled a message to himself on the back. He wrote, as you comb your hair and beard in the morning, say to the mirror, Berryman, God is interested in you and conscious of your struggle and your services. Good luck. He kept trying to urge himself from crisis to purpose, your struggle and your services. His inventories kept circling back to the same futilities and frustrations. Do I feel I'm unstoppable? Yes. Do I ever go on the wagon to prove I can quit? Yes. He didn't even mark yes or no for do I ever get drunk, as if it were a question too obvious to bear answering. His whole life had already answered it. In Berryman's archives, I tracked him wrestling with what he called, quote, the delusion that his art depended on his drinking. Before I got into an Uber back to my hotel with a driver who had recently gotten sober but was struggling to reconnect with his passion for writing Christian rap music. Berryman had wrestled, and the rest of the world was still wrestling. At the writer Jean Reese's archives in Tulsa, Oklahoma, I read notes from one of her last caregivers about the endless battle to limit her daily drinking, how she put more ice cubes in Reese's tumblers that would have less room for booze. And I listened to a recording of Reese's scratchy voice singing the Creole songs of her Dominican youth. The writer David Foster Wallace's archives in Austin, I stumbled across notes he'd written in the margins of his books about sobriety, beside a passage about how it can seem like alcohol glues together all your broken pieces. He'd written simply, "How I feel." How could I possibly express how much it moved me? The simplicity and candor of his response. It made me feel impossibly close to the version of him that had felt this sentiment and then carefully recorded it. Even if that feeling of proximity was a projection, it was a projection in keeping with the structure of recovery itself, hearing yourself and others and feeling consoled by that resonance. The archives were riddled with secret tunnels delivering me back into the lives of strangers who seemed to know me better than I knew myself. The archives offered only partial glimpses, I knew, the specter of a hand stepping out a cigarette, trying to commit himself to inventories that might save him from his own thirst, or the nostalgic voice of a woman whose heart had been able to hold so much pain and so much beauty, but who had still kept coming back to booze anyway, unable to believe in a life without it. But these partial glimpses brought me close to the dead in particular moments of song, of hope, of faith and frustration, and the smudged ink and off-key notes only deepened the visceral impact of their yearning. One of my writing students had once said, "In this class, we worship at the altar of narrative specificity." And it was true that I believed in illuminating the particular grain of a scene or a memory or a life as the best way to excavate and articulate its larger meanings. Any personal inventory carried more significance when you saw its burned paper and its messy handwriting. The detail about the ice cube said more about desperation than the word desperation ever could. If specificity had always been one of the cornerstones of my own writing practice, then the archives, the papers of writers who had gotten drunk and tried to get sober, flooded me with not only the specifics of their distant lives, but with the truth of desire itself. The sensation of feeling flooded by these other lives also fed an ancient hunger to dissolve into emotion, to collapse into intensity, my own or borrowed. At one point during the course of my research, I was on a panel with two other authors, and the moderator asked us what we first thought of when we heard the word surrender. I answered, archives. I joked that I was so obsessed with archives that no matter what word you gave me, archives would be the first thing I thought of in response. But I also insisted that archives and the act of researching in archives was connected to the notion of surrender in powerful ways. I loved feeling surprised and thwarted by the lives of others, feeling subject to them, feeling totally overwhelmed by them. These records of other lives disrupted my pre-existing ideas and narratives with their refusal to conform to simple thesis statements about sorrow or redemption. But it was a lie to say I thought of archives first. Surrender made me think of drinking first. It always would. The more time I spent researching, the more convinced I became that the only version of my project I believed in was one that also confessed what had motivated all this research. I think this is connected to the panel that's about to happen about recovering out loud. The drinking and the quitting, all that terror and hope. I started to imagine writing a book that would bring together personal narrative and all the research I was doing, literary criticism, biographical research, cultural history, and it would somehow do all this without coming apart at the seams. It was simultaneously liberating and terrifying to imagine a book that would confess all the baggage I brought to these archives, how much desire and history and hunger I was bringing to these other lives, rather than dissolving that baggage into the margins of an academic text. I imagine the personal narrative in the book as an inventory of all my psychic stowaways. I envisioned my book as an anti-memoir in which my own story was just one story among many. Though it was also true that I didn't have any idea how to make a book that looked like this. And even if I had, I couldn't have imagined how that making was happening inside the life I was living, which involved daily caregiving and a lot of accountability to the lives of other people. But I believed in a certain glimmering possibility, an echo chamber of a book that could enact the structure of a recovery meeting, its chorus of stories, and also, perhaps, just to be humble about it, the sensation of being alive, or at least how I wanted to be alive, understanding my story in relation to other stories, my voice in relation to other voices. From the beginning, I'd known that I wanted my book to be full of the voices of strangers, and that these strangers wouldn't all be famous writers. I wanted some of these voices to belong to ordinary people, like everyone I'd ever met in recovery who had blown my mind. What was ordinary anyway? I wanted to question the idea of ordinariness entirely, to insist that every single life was infinite and full of meaning, that it held truths you could find nowhere else, and also, in variations, everywhere else. But where would I find these strangers? I didn't want to rely on people I met through recovery. I didn't want to exploit anyone for their stories. I wanted to approach people as a writer instead, with full transparency. Before I could do that, however, a stranger came to me. After I published a column about cliches in the New York Times, I got a letter from a man named Sawyer. He loved my defense of cliches, he said, and had himself come to love cliches during his time in recovery. In fact, he'd started a rehab center in a ramshackle old fishing lodge by the Potomac. It was called Seneca House. He wanted to tell me its story, and I wanted to hear it. I thought, here are my strangers. Over the course of the next year, I interviewed sober alcoholics who had gone through Seneca House, a woman who had promised her young children that she would get help looking at them through hair streaming with vomit one morning, a man who had sensed danger the first time he smoked crack, too sweet, too sweet, too sweet, he thought, a woman who had cruised for booze at night with her kids in the backseat of her car, telling them the letters to look for, L-I-Q-U-O-R, because they couldn't read. Interviewing sober alcoholics was gratifying for many of the same reasons it was frustrating. They were already used to narrating their most traumatic and shameful experiences. This meant they were comfortable sharing these experiences in our interviews, but also that they'd told these stories many times before. They were almost too comfortable. A dutiful acolyte of the reporter Janet Malcolm, who's drawn to moments of friction or disagreement, I was always seeking spaces of discomfort during our talks. My ears pricked for signs that a conversation was summoning some kind of awareness that my subject hadn't ever shared before. I was trying to coax from the people I was speaking to the same thing I was always trying to coax for myself when I wrote, a version of the story that challenged the version I'd become comfortable with. In Portland, for example, I spent the better part of a week with a woman named Shirley, going to meetings, chatting in her apartment, driving around town to see the landmarks of her life. We saw the hospital where she'd been treated for breast cancer and ate at the Italian restaurant where she'd waited to hear if she was still in remission, and where she had purposefully ordered the most expensive thing on the menu, lobster pasta, because she refused to act as if her life was on hiatus because of her illness. We drove out to Mount Hood, where as a young girl, Shirley had always dreamed of staying in the Timberline Lodge. She told me that when her dream finally came true, she was in early sobriety and raising 2 young kids as a single mom. The trip wasn't exactly how she'd imagined it, but this captured an important truth about her sobriety or anyone's. Like life, it doesn't always follow the script you imagined. You find meaning in whatever happens instead. It was striking to see how much it mattered to be in motion with Shirley, how moving across the landscape of the city, of the mountains, the winding roads and restaurant parking lots evoked the pieces of her story that lay beyond its well-practiced grooves. Crossing the Burnside Bridge over the Willamette River summoned the memory of a suicide attempt she hadn't previously mentioned across days of talking and weeks of telephone calls. Shirley's apartment was another kind of archive. It held the partially deflated balloons from her most recent sobriety birthdays, drawings from her young granddaughter, a clipping from her daughter's college newspaper that professed how her daughter's unique sense of style, which Shirley traced back to how she let her daughter choose her own clothes as a girl, how Shirley's desire to grant her kids more autonomy in turn was a product of her own sobriety, letting go of the impulse to control others. In Shirley's apartment and in her history, I could see 1,000 glimmering threads connecting all the ordinary, beautiful pieces of her life. On my red-eye flight back to New York, I stayed up all night typing notes from the visit. I felt guilty about being away from home. At the same time, I was glad to have gone. More than anything, I was giddy from encountering the infinitude of another life. This was the kind of giddiness I felt in meetings when I heard the ordinary details of other people getting better. It never failed to take my breath away. This thrill was closely, inevitably attended by the daunting pressure of how to make art from this infinitude, how to capture another person's life or my own in all that giddy wonder on the page. My own book kept getting bigger. It was like it had a disease. The more I wrote, the less complete it seemed. The logic wasn't unfamiliar, wanting more booze, more men, more sentences, and then feeling perpetually that they weren't enough. The guiding questions of my book were endless, or rather, each one had a trap door in its floor that revealed more questions beneath. It was easy to call it a book about drinking, but maybe it was really a book about storytelling itself. The idea of telling stories in order to create something beautiful from pain. The idea of telling stories in order to survive your own life. Maybe it was a book about narrative disguised as a book about drinking. Maybe it was a book about ambition disguised as a book about narrative, disguised as a book about drinking. Was the desire to write a book this big simply a sign of my ego? Did it run against the ethos of humility that the book was ostensibly celebrating, that sense of feeling yourself become smaller in a room full of strangers? So much of my drinking had been about numbing the constant siren call of my own ambition. Maybe this was just about my ambition was taking in sobriety. In any case, the word count kept creeping up. The book kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. I'd always had an aversion to taking up too much space. I'd restricted my eating for years for just that reason. And maybe this ballooning draft was asking me to push back against that shame. Here I was, taking up space, but I still felt the shame of excess. Writing too much personal narrative felt like drunkenly cornering someone at a party and forcing him to listen to me talk about my feelings for hours. One afternoon, one of my graduate students asked me, why is my story worth telling anyway? This was the question they were always asking, even though they also consistently wanted more personal narrative for other students' essays. This particular student looked out my office window and started pointing at strangers walking the pathways below. Why is my story more important than his, she asked, indicating a boy smoking in the courtyard, or more important than hers, or his, or hers? It's not, I said. You don't have to pretend it is in order to write about it. I was saying what I believed and what I needed to believe. My book was my own version of pointing at strangers out the window and saying, his story is just as important as mine, and hers too. But when and how did it end? I hadn't figured that part out. It felt impossible, or at least irresponsible, to tell the story of the founding of Alcoholics Anonymous in the mid-1930s, for example, without talking about how the war on drugs was kicking into high gear at exactly the same time. I couldn't tell the story of our national cognitive dissonance without narrating both parts of the paradox, addiction as a disease and addiction as a crime. Also, how could I tell the stories of all these white male literary geniuses without telling the stories of people who hadn't been white and hadn't been men? Being black or white or male or female meant your addiction story got marked as a totally different genre. It started to feel impossible to tell my own story without exploring the whiteness at its core. It felt important to insist that my story, the story of a nice white girl who drank too much, was not unrelated to the stories of addiction that were told as stories of vice, guilt, monstrosity, or moral failure. Why had I gotten the camaraderie of church basements and phone numbers and lukewarm coffee, while a woman addicted to meth in Arizona had gotten sentenced in the same year I'd gotten sober to an infamous tent city where she eventually died of heat stroke in a desert cage? I knew the risks of writing a book that tried to bring these stories together. Some people would believe I was forcing an absurd equivalence between my pain and the pain of others. Juxtaposition would become conflation. The point, of course, was to illuminate the differences rather than to pretend they didn't exist. To ask, why did her dependence get met with one kind of response while mine got met with another? In this way, the structure of the book reflected one of the ethical dilemmas it was trying to explore. How do you examine the resonance between stories without forcing a false equivalence between them? How could the chorus of my book honor what felt beautiful about a meeting in which people who had lived very different lives might find some common ground without becoming ridiculously naive? This dilemma showed up in meetings as well. How much is shared in this space? As legend has it, the Winchester family mansion is haunted by all the people killed by Winchester rifles. And even its architecture is spooked and strange. Narrow staircases leading nowhere, trick doors on creaky hinges at the back of closets, unexpected doorways at the end of dim hallways. When I first read about that house, I thought, that's my book. Not just full of expanding hallways and sudden portals, but absolutely haunted by all the folks who hadn't made it while I got to drink my coffee and chew my pen caps. My pages swelled with their ghosts. Eventually, I had to stop making my book bigger and start making it better. In creating my massive draft, I'd been committed to the idea of a huge building, piling large blocks of narrative on top of one another like testimonies in a meeting, not just risking boredom or excess, but actually courting these experiences. In a meeting, it felt like a kind of ethical commitment to sit still and listen, no matter what you felt. And it was as if I was asking my readers to do that for hundreds of pages, to sit still and keep reading no matter what they felt. It took me a while to admit it to myself, but eventually I did. The structure of my book wasn't working. It made you feel like you were climbing a huge hill. I insisted on these huge narrative chunks, imagining that there was something virtuous in asking a reader to trudge through each one, the same way it felt virtuous to sit through every contribution in a meeting. But this wasn't a meeting, this was a book. It needed momentum. It needed to create some feeling of urgency that might move readers through its pages rather than simply asking them to wander through a massive gallery of stories. If my book was intentionally refusing to satisfy certain narrative hungers for resolution, for originality, for a single uninterrupted narrative of personal disclosure, for the compelling train wrecks of dysfunction and disorder, then I thought it needed to do something more than simply leave these hungers unsatisfied. It had to satisfy other hungers that maybe readers didn't even know they had, for choral resonance, for slippage between private and social scales, for ragged arcs of recovery, for stories about getting better that were just as dynamic, just as compelling as stories about falling apart. This narrative logic wasn't unlike the logic of recovery itself, which had replaced my first understanding of what it would mean to stop drinking, that it would feel like straight deprivation, and replaced it with another understanding of sobriety as a kind of unexpected plenitude. Recovery didn't satisfy the same hungers as my drinking had. It satisfied deeper hungers I hadn't even known I had. The desire to live inside my own skin without wanting to flee it at every single moment, the possibility of finding solace in the voices of strangers. It became clear I couldn't just edit the draft I had. That verb was just a euphemism my editor was using. I I had to take apart and rebuild the whole book, had to take the large stone blocks of its narrative sections and carve them into something shaped by questions. I had to burrow into its massive chunks of story and find dark caverns of experience and then illuminate them with inquiry. I spent an 8-hour train ride to a work obligation in Vermont, making an outline of the entire draft and asking myself what questions were at its core. This list of questions became a conceptual manifesto for my gut renovation. My questions were various. What was I trying to escape when I drank? Why did intimacy always make me feel insecure? What if telling the story of your pain doesn't offer you any relief from it? When and how does self-awareness fail us? Writing out my core questions helped me see a way forward. It helped me understand not just that my long narratives needed sculpting, but what particular shapes I wanted my sculpting to expose. In the meantime, as my train rolled through the barn-strewn meadows of Vermont, the man sitting beside me got slowly, quietly drunk on little bottles of whiskey he pulled from his backpack. Eventually, he started crying. He was middle-aged, maybe 45 or 50. He told me his father was dying. He gave me his yellow business card. It said 3D Association of New York. It held the warmth of his hand. I thought, every pain is valid. Every human life is infinite. Is it sentimental to say that every drunk stranger I met reminded me why I was writing my book in the first place? It's true. With that stranger on that train, I realized how badly I wanted to believe in telling stories as a way of taking care of people, even taking care of strangers. With that stranger on that train, I realized that I already did believe in telling stories as a way of taking care of people. Recovery had taught me that. As it happened, when I finally brought this book into the world, I was thinking about caregiving in a new way. It had taken me 8 years to write the book, and now I had a daughter who was just 3 months old, and the daily act of caring for her was consuming, exhausting, expanding. My mother came with me and my baby on a book tour. 4 weeks, 19 cities. We stood at curbside baggage stands in Boston, Las Vegas, Cedar Rapids, San Francisco, Albuquerque, with our ridiculous caravan. Suitcases, car seat, travel stroller, pack and play. The unbuckled baby carrier hung loose from my waist like a second skin. We ticked away our flights in silent little rosaries, praying she'd nap on the plane, praying the flight attendant would let me keep her in the carrier, praying she'd nurse on the final descent, praying we'd remember the white noise machine, praying we could find a hardware store with the screwdriver we needed to replace the dead batteries in the white noise machine. When I heard my baby cry beside me in a Detroit hotel room at 4 in the morning, the 4th time she'd woken up that night, I knew the 4-month sleep regression had finally arrived. It didn't care how many state lines we'd crossed. It found us anyway. The dilemma we sometimes call work-life balance found me in bookstore signing lines while my breasts ached and wept, reminding me there was a baby across the city who was ready to nurse. Her tiny face hovered in my mind's eye while people shared their impossibly difficult stories about desperation, relapse, and watching the suffering of loved ones. They wanted something from me, compassion or kinship or solutions, or else they simply wanted me as a witness, and I wanted to give this to them, always, but I also wanted to nurse my baby. In these lines, strangers got under my skin like splinters. In a voice so soft it was nearly a whisper, a woman asked whether I thought moderation ever worked. Another woman told me she'd been in the hospital when I read in San Francisco, so she'd driven all the way down Interstate 5 to hear me in Los Angeles. She wanted to know how I came to believe sobriety could stick. A woman just out of rehab asked if it ever got easier. A man 9 months sober asked if he would ever stop dreaming about booze. As if I could possibly answer these questions. We all in my book couldn't absolutely answer anything. but it could tell them that someone else had been wondering. I told the man who dreamed of whiskey that I didn't know if he would ever stop dreaming of booze entirely. I still dreamed of booze sometimes, but I dreamed of a lot of other things too. In Minneapolis, a woman told me that my book had helped her feel a little bit closer to her son, who was still shooting heroin but wanted to stop, had tried to stop, and what could she do? What should she do? My gut tightened with panic when I realized it wasn't a rhetorical question. And honestly, in that moment, I was still always inevitably thinking of my baby girl back in our hotel room with my mother, waiting to nurse before I swaddled her and put her down. Was she crying? Was my mother walking her around the block in the carrier, checking her watch, wondering when I'd be back to feed her? When I looked at the woman standing in front of me, I knew that her son had been a baby once too, nursing or refusing to, sleeping or refusing to. No matter what I said to her, it would never be enough. No matter what I said to her, my baby would still be hungry. This mother would walk into the night, and I would walk into the night. She would keep loving her child, and I would keep loving my child. Our love couldn't promise us anything, but we both knew we would never see the end of it. Thank you.